During and just after the War of 1812, there was a depletion of local residents around Sodus Point because of the uncertainty of the security of the region. But once the war had been won, a new wave of settlers came to the Bay Area. In the next 3 years, roads were built to Oswego from Port Glasgow at the southern end of Sodus Bay, and from Troopville to Montezuma. In 1819, a company was formed to construct the first bridge over the bay at Port Glasgow, connecting the Ridge Road with the road to Wolcott and Oswego. The addition of roads and the improvement of farms and town properties of the area were key to the rapidly increasing prosperity in these times, and the ability of local merchants and farmers to ship their goods by both land and water was a key factor in the area's growth. When the whispering started regarding the construction of a waterway from Lake Erie across northern New York State to the sea, there were many who scoffed at the idea. But as the project was pushed to completion in 1825, the doubts became cheers. The Erie Canal made possible the large-scale shipment of the products of the area at a tenth of the former costs to the markets along its route and beyond. Into this picture in 1826, there came a sect of Quakers called the Shakers. Joseph Pelham and his wife Susanna, who had converted to the Shaker religion through the influence of Pelham's brother Richard, organized a Shaker family in the town of Galen in 1824. The two brothers petitioned the Shaker Central Ministry in New Lebanon, New York, to establish a Shaker community in Wayne County. After several months of investigation, a site was selected on a 1,300-acre tract of land which bordered most of the southwestern side of Sodus Bay. The Shakers purchased the property from Ann Nicholas, widow of Judge John Nicholas, for the sum of $12,600 on February 23, 1826. The Shaker religion was at that time some 50 years old, having been founded in 1775 by Anne Lee, who had emigrated to America from Manchester, England. She was a religious mystic of the time and the leader of a split-off sect of Quakers. The sect believed in celibacy for all members and offered a formula for certain salvation by confessing one's sins and dedication of one's property and labor to the common good. Like the Quakers, the Shakers were pacifists and rejected all forms of violence, even when physically attacked. The principle of equality of the sexes was carried out in the appointment of leaders at every level of authority in all Shaker community activities. This was reflected in living quarters which were separate for men and women, but equal for all. Obedience to authority and suppression of individualism to the common will of the group was paramount. The living organization was communal in every sense of the word. At the time the Sodus community was established, the Shakers had 10 other communities of people actively living their philosophy in New York, New England, and Ohio. The master community in New Lebanon, New York, was the home of the controlling elders of the sect, and as new communities were formed, this group acted to seed the new locations with qualified elders to advise, administrate, and otherwise help the new groups as they grew. The Shakers were widely known as craftsmen and outstanding farmers. They pioneered in the farm seed industry and were among the first to select, package, and sell seed throughout the Northeast. They were also inventors of farm tools and makers of beautiful and functional furniture. The Sodus Shaker community benefited from long years of Shaker tradition and experience in its formative years. The Sodus location was ideal. The land was heavily wooded with stands of maple, beech, ash, bass, whitewood, chestnut, oak, and hemlock. The property contained one grist mill in poor repair, 2 dwelling houses in satisfactory condition, a few small framed buildings, 2 common barns, and 2 small stables. It also contained 2 small streams called Second Creek and Third Creek, and about 2 miles of shoreline on the southwest side of Sodus Bay. The new preemption line divided the property north to south almost exactly in half. Thus, the property was in the town of Port Bay on the east and in the town of Sodus on the west. At first, the Shakers lived in one of the buildings in the east section of the property. The run-down grist mill was repaired and began grinding in April 1826. A sawmill was built by the end of September and began to saw lumber for the Shakers themselves and for shipments from the wharf at the shore at Nicholas Point. The Shaker community was divided into groups called families, each of whom had a residence for their members. Each family had a male and female elder who functioned as the leader of their corresponding brotherhood or sisterhood of family members. By 1834, there were 4 families at the Sodus community: the Gathering Order for Newcomers, the Center family, the local ministry, who lived on the second floor of the meeting house, and the First or Church family. Membership in the community grew over time to about 150 members, selected from the 330 people who came seeking association over the years. Throughout the period, the Shakers built barns, mills, and other buildings required for the needs of the community and its business ventures. The 2 newer residence buildings were constructed in 1830 and 1833. The Shaker Meeting House was completed in 1831. The residence building of the First or Church family still stands today and is the main residence of the Alesa farm. The meeting house was destroyed in a fire in 1925. The pig barn is still in useful condition. The most important financial support for the Sodus Shakers came from the garden seed industry. They ran a profitable business in which prepackaged seed was consigned to the many country stores of New York and Pennsylvania. Their salesmen traveled their routes in early spring to deliver the seed to these stores. In the fall, they returned again to collect the income and leftover seed from this profitable venture. In 1826, the Erie Canal had been completed, and the traffic on the canal passed through Clyde, Lyons, Newark, and Palmyra, only 10 miles from the southern end of Sodus Bay. By 1835, the commerce on the canal was substantial, and a connecting ship canal north from Clyde was proposed with the entrance to Sodus Bay to be gained at the mouth of Third Creek on the Shaker property. Faced with a state-approved proposal which allowed the builders to force landowners to give up land for a canal right-of-way through the middle of their property, the Shakers decided to sell and move on west rather than to deal with the interruption of their life the proposed canal project would cause. Following their decision to relocate, the Sodus Shakers purchased 1,600 acres of land southwest of Rochester, New York at Groveland, about 50 miles to the west. They began to move their belongings from Sodus in January 1837. The move from Sodus took a year and a half and marked the beginning of another pioneering period for the community. William H. Adams, the negotiator for the Sodus Canal Company, agreed to buy the Shaker property at Sodus for $133,000 in April 1837. However, the amount of litigation and political wrangling which was required to obtain payment from the canal company over the next 4 years was unbelievable. This upheaval seems to have sapped the strength of the group and was especially perverse since the Sodus Canal turned out to be a figment of Adams' imagination. On April 1, 1844, in a final effort to raise the money required to beat an 1846 deadline for canal completion, Adams sold the Shaker property to a socialist group called the Fourierists. This experiment in socialist living was based upon the utopian philosophy of Charles Fourier and was popularized by some of the famous men of the time, such as Horace Greeley and Albert Brisbane. The experiment at Sodus was a failure and a model of disorganization. In 2 years' time, they managed to rebuild a mill on Second Creek and to run themselves into the ground trying to implement their utopian philosophies in direct and practical use. Their socialist experiment came to financial failure in 1845, and in March 1846, the land passed into the hands of John Gregg and Alexander Duncan, the creditors of the Sodus Bay Canal Company. In about 1852, the property passed from Duncan and Gregg to DeWitt Parshall, who was the most extensive dealer and owner of real estate in the area at that time, and the founder of the bank in Lyons. Thus, the first half of the 19th century had been a somewhat confusing and interrupted period of events. All pointed towards the establishment of connecting links to the Sodus Bay area from the south and east, and there was much more to come in the next half-century. William Adams continued his efforts to obtain financing and state approval for a Sodus to Clyde Canal for the next 15 years, and in 1852 even began excavation on some of the sections in the Clyde area. But the project never came to fruition, and with Adams' death in 1865, the canal project lost its last proponent. Not one shovelful of dirt was ever turned on the Shaker property for this project, but its effect on the Sodus Shaker community was certainly immense. The Shakers built an attractive community in Groveland, but they never regained the stature and vitality they had achieved at their first property at Sodus.